Let's tinker a little bit more with our CSS rule here for our paragraph tags. So I'm going to decrease the font size by a bit because I don't like them being quite so big. And let's see if we can kind of get a deeper understanding of the box model, right? Recall this, this representation of the box model. So if we want to take a quick look, again, just as a reminder, we can right click on one of these paragraphs, inspect, and we can kind of see some details, right? So they have a 30 pixel margin on the top and bottom. We can see that here, but no border, no padding, nothing going on there. So what if we were to add padding? Another thing I want to do is, this is something I do all the time, is if I'm working on a particular piece in terms of CSS, I give it a specific background color that's different than the rest of the page, just so that you can kind of easily pull out what section you are explicitly working on. So I'll color it teal for now, and we can come back in and change it later. So let's see what happens if we do kind of start to play around with some of these box model related properties. For example, let's say we want to add some padding on the top of all of our paragraphs. Let's try adding a 50 pixel padding on top, and let's see what happens. Okay, I'll refresh this. Notice that the background is still teal, except now we have all this padding on top. Right? And that makes sense when you consider the fact that padding, you can sort of consider it part of the content a little bit. Right? Because it's kind of adding padding between the border, which would be somewhere around here, and our content. Right? This is all pure padding here. And if we, again, inspect it now that we've updated it, we can kind of scroll down. We can see that our padding has been set. Right? So you can see it highlighted here. It's been set. You can tell in your Chrome Dev Tools. And you can, of course, set the other padding sides as well. So padding left, 25 pixels, padding right, 50 pixels, padding bottom. Let's do 30 pixels. Going to be looking pretty weird. Right, so it's spaced out a little weird, but we see we have padding here and there and on the bottom. Now, let's see if we can figure out the difference between padding and margin. Right, so again, if we inspect, what's our margin look like? Well, we don't have any margins on the side. It does appear to have some margin just because the body element itself does have some built-in margin on it. And that's just a web browser thing. Don't really need to worry about it. But if you're wondering why there's a bit of space here, it's because there's some default styling applied to the entire body. Now, in any case, we can see that there's no margin on these paragraphs by default. But what if we want to add one? Right, we want to make sure that there's a kind of a nice margin in there. Well, that's simple enough as well. We can do margin left. Let's do 20 pixels on the left. Let's see what that looks like. Refresh. Right, so notice that it didn't affect the background color, and it just kind of added some margin here. Right, recall that margin is kind of the space outside of the content and padding. So this is how you can kind of separate your content from other content. And it would make sense if we want to have a bigger margin on the top and bottom of these elements. Well, we can just do something like margin bottom 20 pixels, margin top 20 pixels, and these are just arbitrary numbers I'm using right now, by the way. But it looks like it actually sort of reduced the default margin. Right? So what if we increased it? Let's say 50 and 50. Refresh. Right? So now there's a big margin here and here and here and on the bottom of this paragraph. Right? Again, we can inspect it and we'll scroll down and we can kind of highlight. Okay, so look at all this margin on the top, 50 on the top, 50 on the bottom. Right? It kind of starts to make sense. And you can really use this kind of same logic to grab any element you need. So you know what, I will get rid of this padding and margin stuff. I'll leave the color as teal on the paragraphs for now. But one thing you could do if you really wanted to is, let's say you're not satisfied with the size of this H1. And normally I would recommend leaving H1 the same size, but if you did want to increase the size, maybe this H1 is just not big enough, you want something even more bigger and bolder, for example, well, let's go ahead and let's grab the H1. And again, I think we only have H1 once on our web page, so we don't have to worry about side effects. So we'll just grab the H1 and we can increase the font size. Let's see, we'll try 20 pixels and see what that looks like. Refresh. Okay, so that actually made it smaller. That had the opposite effect of what I wanted. So let's try sizing it up. 50 pixels, that looks a little bit bigger. Let's try 60 pixels. Refresh. Okay, cool. Now let's see, since we're working on this one, we'll add a background color here as well. I'll just do teal because it's pretty easy on the eyes. Right, so we can see it takes up the entire width here, minus this kind of default body margin. So what if you wanted to center this text? What's the property to do that? Well, that one, it's just text align. Let me see. Center should do the trick. This is how we want the text inside the H1 to be aligned. So we refresh, and hey, there we go. We see that it's now aligned. Cool, so that works pretty well. And it looks nice because it just kind of, the browser just by default extended it to be the entire width of its containing element. And the containing element of this H1, it's the main, which has as a parent the body. So, if all this was indented one space, that might make it a bit more clear. Right, so all of these things are children of body. So we have this as a child, this is a child. So really you consider the H1 as sort of a grandchild of the body. But because we don't have like explicit width set anywhere, that's why I just kind of expanded out to fill the width here. Now that would change if we did set a width on the H1, for example. So let's see what happens if we explicitly set a width. And let's do a width of just 200 pixels. And let's see what that looks like. Right, so now it's not nearly as wide. That's a bit too small though, so I'm going to widen it a little bit. Let's try 500. Right, and now the text itself, it's still centered, but it's centered inside of the H1. And the H1 only has so much width that it can use. So this is something that you'll probably spend a lot of time tinkering around with when you're learning CSS. And you know what? Even experienced developers do tend to tinker around a lot with their CSS to get it to look how they want it to look. And just to try a different example, let's try 1000 pixels in terms of width. Right? So it still does not appear to be centered on the page. The text itself is centered. It's just that the container, it's only this amount of width. Right? So that's something to consider. And you know what? I'll remove this and let's see what happens now. Now what happens if I were to grab the parent of this H1? And that really is, that's a really good way to think about these elements, is that they have parents and grandparents, and these elements have children and grandchildren, for example. And what I'm getting at basically is if we set an explicit width on our main element, that will affect all of the children elements of main. So let's see what I mean by that. So I'm going to set a width here on main of 1000 pixels. And we'll see how it affects the rest of these pieces. So let's refresh. Right? And now all of our content, you notice that it has the exact same width, except this footer, which is actually outside of main. Right? We close main and then we have a footer. And the header at the very top is also not included in main. But in any case, we can see that the effects kind of rippled down, right? So we have an explicit width now set on main. And main has a whole bunch of children. And that's really a key concept to understanding CSS. Think about the name. It's cascading style sheets. So whenever you set a property on some kind of general selector like main that has a whole bunch of children, it's gonna cascade down through all the children. So this could have serious effects, right? So your width, usually you don't really set an explicit width on main like this, but you could if you wanted to. Then you could have a separate element kind of sitting over on the side, perhaps. You could also do something like, okay, I want all of my fonts to have this color in my main, color white, for example. And this color property is how you set font color. So if I refresh, right, again, I didn't have to go in and manually select all of these elements because they're all children of main. The only ones that weren't affected are those that are not contained inside the main element. Right, so pretty important concept a pretty key concept when it comes to CSS, is kind of understanding what it means when something cascades down.